Hello everyone, this is Phil Hickey, and as promised, here is part 2 of how to make an underwater hockey glove. In part 1, I showed you how to make the base layer, so this is what was finished at the end of step 1, and the product at the end of step 2 is something like this. Basically we have the same underlying glove, but now on top of the base layer we have layers of padding added to the fronts of all the fingers, the back of the thumb, and up on the back of the hand if you so choose, a little bit on the palm where the heel of the thumb hits the ground. So that's what we're shooting for. Let's get started. For supplies we have our poster paint, a tube of clear silicone caulk, bucket to mix in, stick to do the mixing with. I like sticks that are pretty thin but also have a lot of rigidity and stiffness, so I actually cut them out of hardwood on the table saw. You can use popsicle sticks for this, but they sometimes break when you're pressing hard or trying to rake a dollop of silicone that's starting to dry. I use a poly food service glove under the base layer. This isn't 100% necessary on this step. The base layer usually doesn't leak silicone through to your hand, but I like to put it on just in case if there's any gaps in the base layer. You don't want that silicone getting through to your skin. And I use a bucket of soapy water. This is just liquid dishwashing detergent mixed with water, and a couple of sticks with sharp points on the edge. We'll use those, dip them in the soapy water, and then use them to do some final shaping and also to cut the notches that I put into the fingers, which allow the fingers to bend fairly readily even with thick layers of padding on them. Okay, I've already squirted. I use about 10 squirts from my caulk gun of the silicone caulk in the bucket, and I mix the paint in at a ratio of 1 drop for every 2 squirts. So we're going to put 5 drops in. Again, these are nice small drops. You don't want to force it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then mix that up. Make sure you get a really good mix. This is one part where having a reasonably sturdy mixing stick can be important. If you break your popsicle stick off at this stage, then you gotta scramble and go get a new one while your caulk is already starting to set up. That's well mixed, and as you can see we have a nice vibrant color. You tend to get much more brilliant colors if you use the clear silicone. Remember on the base layer we used white silicone, which resulted in a much more pastel muted color. For the padding layer I like to do something that stands out a little. Obviously you want to avoid reds and yellows because those are usually reserved for referees' gloves. Okay, now we're going to slip on the poly food service glove. Remember, if this gives you trouble, you can always put a little baby powder on your hands. My hands are a little sweaty this evening, so it'll take me a little while to get that on there. And then into our base layer. I have separated the fingers on my base layer. At the end of making the base layer, they're usually stuck together a little bit. And just rip them apart after they're totally dry. And you'll see why in a minute. We use the stick to kind of tool in between the fingers. It's important to be able to separate them. Okay, now you want to work as quickly as you can here, because your caulk will set up. I like to get a pretty good dollop that runs a couple of inches down the stick, and then just sort of scrape it off the side of the stick onto the finger like that. And we're just gently going to smooth. You do a lot of smoothing with silicone by pulling on it. You want to sort of press the stick in and then pull it, just like you're icing a cake with a spatula or a sharp knife. Just press and pull. Round over the edges by pressing down and sort of raking like that. down the side of the finger. And there we've got most of the index finger. It's useful to have your bucket of caulk well supported. I can usually hold it between my knees, but it's also nice to have something solid that you can clamp the bucket to, which is a trick I sometimes use and forgot to do tonight. So we're just going to continue adding silicone. Try to keep your stick reasonably clean. So every so often you'll see me just kind of scrape off the excess on the edge of my bucket. And continue that cake icing motion. Press and pull. People sometimes ask me how I get the edges of the padding layer so neat and clean. If you just use the corner of your stick to press all the way down to the base layer and then rake away, you get a really nice clean edge. And you can do any kind of shapes. If you want a rounded edge at the back, you can kind of work around it into a circle. If you want a triangle or a point at the back, you can get that. Lots of different ways to do it. You want to think obviously primarily about where you want padding and where you don't, but aesthetics are also important. It's nice to have a nice looking glove, so you can be artistic if you so choose. One thing you'll notice as you work through this process is at different stages in the drying, the silicone takes on very different properties in terms of its cohesion, its adhesion, how well it sticks to other things like the stick and the base layer, and how easy it is to move the surface around, how easy it is to cut into it. And as we'll see later, it's kind of important to get certain parts of the job done at certain phases of the silicone's curing. Most notably the step where we cut the notches into the fingers to make them bend more readily. You kind of need a very specific set of properties in the silicone to get that to work. Fortunately, those properties come about when it's most of the way cured but not quite, so we can do that very last thing. Okay, so I've got 2 fingers done now. Working my way along. The order I usually go in is index, middle, ring, little finger, and then the thumb. But you can do them in different order. I sometimes, if I want to make a really, really good glove, I will sometimes do alternating fingers, so I'll do the index finger and the ring finger and the thumb on one pass, and then later, once those have cured, I'll mix up a whole new batch of silicone and do the middle finger and the little finger. And that just gives you obviously more time to work the silicone and not quite as rushed and making mistakes as you go. I find that it's useful to put the thickest padding layer on the first 2 fingers, the index finger and the middle finger, and then get thinner as I go towards the pinky, towards the ring finger and the little finger. Just because those fingers don't get hit as often or as hard in my experience during hockey. You're going to realize as you get down the hand that the silicone you've already placed on the previous fingers gets in your way. And so it becomes a bit of a challenge to get the stick into an orientation that allows you to trowel the finger you're working on to shape that silicone without bumping or interfering with the silicone on the ones you've already done. And you kind of have to just do what you need to do to make it work. And obviously practice makes perfect. If you do enough of them, you'll figure out all the little tricks that make it go smoothly. every time I see a place where the silicone is kind of dolloped out with a corner that could get snagged or tear off, I just try to smooth it in. And I'm also working on the little points at the top of the finger, which I find aesthetically appealing. Down at the tips of the fingers, in the last knuckle, I usually taper the padding layer. Try to make it a little thinner on that last knuckle. And the reason for that is that last knuckle sits underneath your stick when you're playing, and the thinner the padding there, the closer your stick will sit to the bottom, which generally makes it easier to maneuver the puck and throw passes. Okay, we're on to the little finger now. Almost finished. The little finger gets easier again because now suddenly you've got an exposed edge of your hand. You're not working between two other fingers. So in that sense it's a little more like the index finger. A little easier to get the trowel around to the positions you need. If you notice me saying trowel a lot, it's a result of all the masonry work I did as a child growing up. Whenever I'm working with a semi-liquid material, it always makes me think of mortar, concrete, which, as my father used to say, are actually living things if you really think about them. They kind of have a mind of their own. And the silicone is sort of like that. You have to get to understand it and learn what it will do and what it won't do, and it just takes practice. So don't feel bad if you don't get it right away. I'm still learning things to this day, and I've done a lot of these. Okay, so I'm reasonably well padded on all my fingers. Still have a little cleaning up to do and shaping and making it look pretty. Remember that technique for getting clean edges. If you just slice down all the way to the base layer and then peel away, keeping good pressure, the stick will just remove all the silicone past the point where you press down. And you'll get that nice clean line. Okay, we're going to go to the thumb next. Oops. Try not to spill the bucket all over my lap. The thumb is the easiest finger to do because it's separated from all the others. It's really easy to get at both sides of it, which is one of the reasons I leave it to last. Towards the end, the silicone is starting to stiffen up and it makes it a little harder to work with, so if you're working on an easy finger at that point, it won't be quite as frustrating. And I usually go pretty thick on the thumb. I hate getting clobbered on my thumb, and I find that unlike the other fingers, I don't need a ton of dexterity in my thumb. It doesn't usually move around much, just kind of sits on the back of the stick and provides power for flicks. And as anybody who's ever taken a hard blow to the thumb can attest, it's a real bummer when your thumb is sore or not working well. So I like to try to keep it healthy. And I also build up a pretty good dollop right down on the last knuckle. There's no need to keep it thin here since your thumb doesn't sit underneath the stick. And I do frequently get hit right on the tip of the thumb. So I'm just trying to build it up kind of thick over that area. You probably noticing by this point that the silicone is getting stiffer, harder to work with, and that is inevitable. So you just have to make do. Just taking a look now back at the fingers while I still have time, looking for anything I missed, any little smoothing that I can still do, or places where I don't have quite enough, maybe too much padding. And it's looking pretty good. Okay, so there's thumb, index, middle, ring, and pinky, all with a nice solid layer of padding. At this point I often go back and add a little dollop right up on the top knuckle where the finger joins the hand. It can be difficult to get the silicone to stick to itself at this point. Sometimes it just tries to sort of clump up. But if you're patient, work at it, you can usually make it work. At this point, the silicone's actually getting a little easier to work because the stuff that I put on earlier is getting pretty stiff, and so I don't tend to dislodge any of that as I try to add new places. Okay, I'm going to put a little smear right here on the palm of the hand, just at the base of the thumb. To spread the edges of that, make them smooth. Not everybody agrees that you need padding there. Some people wear through their gloves in that spot, some don't. If you find that you are wearing through, you can add a little more there. If you find that you're not, you can leave it blank. And I often don't even bother up here on the back of my hand. If you like to have padding there, you can certainly do the same kind of thing. Add nice flat layers, smooth them out, and then you can make them look pretty by using the scrape and pull method. Give yourself little angles or circles or squares. Whatever makes you happy. And we've got a little triangle. Maybe do one more over here. Silicone is getting stiff, so I think we're going to be done after that one. It's harder and harder to clean off the stick at this point because the silicone really wants to stick to it. There's just a couple of little geometric shapes on the back. Like I said, you can do whatever makes you happy. I'm just going to go in between the fingers now and do a little scrape. Just press hard against the side of the finger. I'm not up in the padding layer here, I'm just sort of in the thin area between the fingers. I just want to make sure there isn't too much silicone down there that can stick and really glue the fingers together. The fingers are going to stick a little bit just like they did with the base layer, and that's okay. I'm just trying to avoid any big dollops in there that are going to kind of smush around when they stick to each other. So you can kind of see the side there. You should see the base layer exposed on the sides of the fingers. Okay, so we're in pretty good shape. We're on to the last step now, which is to get out your bucket of soapy water and your sharp stick. Should be kind of similar to the one you mixed with. I just use these little stubby ones because they were cut off, so I had left over. But you want kind of a sharp edge on the point of the stick. And the reason for that is we're going to use it to just press in. I'm going to go right here. I go just a little below the point of that first knuckle. And if you have the consistency of the silicone just right, you should get a nice clean slice just by pressing straight down. If the silicone is too sticky, if you've started this process too early before it started to cure, the silicone will stick to your stick and you'll get lumps of it that kind of pull out when the stick comes off. If you wait too long, it's difficult to slice because the silicone has a skim over its surface. And that skim resists the sharp point on the stick, and it's very, very difficult. And I sometimes at that point will actually get out my utility knife and carefully slice through that skin. It's kind of like cutting through the skin of a chicken when you're cutting it up to put it in the fryer. But right now we have the consistency just right, so I'm going to hurry and get all these cut right now while I have a good window of opportunity. So I'm pressing, I like to press all the way down to the base layer on these, just enough pressure to cut through the padding, and then I also will wiggle the stick back and forth like this a little bit just to expand those cuts and sort of make them into little crevasses, which does two things. One, it prevents them from sticking back together, because at this point the silicone is still wet enough that the edges of the cuts can glue themselves back together and essentially destroy the flexibility of your glove. And also, when I bend the stick back and forth like that, I'm widening the cut a little bit, which obviously provides a little bit more opportunity for the fingers to straighten without bunching up the padding. So you're shooting for cuts that go all the way down and make just sort of a V shape when you look at their profile. Not sure if you guys can see that on the camera, but you're just looking for a notch with a little bit more separation at its top than at its bottom. And this is working really well. We've got perfect consistency for this. It's not always this easy. So definitely don't feel bad if this part gives you trouble. Another thing you can do at this point, with the soapy water on the stick, you can really smush and kind of press on the surface of the silicone. So if there's any place where you want to reshape it a little bit, if you want to smush some from one side of a finger maybe over to the other, you can just kind of push, and it shouldn't stick to the stick much, if at all. You can also do a little cleaning up on the edges, on any of the places where you want sharp lines. And here what I do is I kind of press into the glove and then move towards the edge that I'm trying to maintain. So if I want to maintain this edge here, I'll start over here and press into it. So you can actually kind of rake the silicone, just like you're collecting sand into a pile on the beach. You kind of mush it towards the place where it's thick. And just kind of clean up the corners and the lines. You want to shoot for minimal disturbance though, because if you gouge the padding layer up off of its bottom and tear it loose from the padding layer, then you kind of have to start over again on that section. So just little subtle changes. Press in on the edges. And be sensitive during this to places where the silicone might be more or less dry. The silicone tends to cure, once you put it on the glove, it starts to cure a little faster than what's left in the bucket. So the first finger that you did, even though it was mixed at the same time as the last finger, that silicone will probably be a little drier when you're doing this step. So as you work your way through the fingers, be aware that they may get a little gooier and stickier as you get towards the end. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened as I'm trying to cut the thumb now, which was the last one I did. The silicone is sticking to my stick a little bit. I'm going to switch to a different stick. Once the stick gets a little silicone on it, it tends to stick to the cuts that you try to do after that a little worse. So a clean stick will help if you're having trouble. And I'm just going very gingerly here. I'm actually not cutting all the way to the bottom yet. I'm going going to do it sort of in stages. So I've gone about halfway down on that cut. I'm going to get some more soapy water, drip a little soapy water into the cut, and then press the rest of the way down. When you do enough of these, you can get a feel for when the silicone is sticking before you really get into it and tear out a huge dollop. So I can tell that at the very bottom of this cut, I'm sticking to the silicone just a little. So I'm going to try to wipe off the silicone that's stuck to my stick. There's just a little bit, but it's enough to cause the rest. Remember, silicone sticks very well to itself, so if there's a little silicone on your stick, it's going to try to stick more to the silicone that's on the glove. Okay, now we're going to get the last cut. Again, going gingerly. This one's working a little better, actually. And remembering to, you can probably see the cuts a little better on the thumb. So I'm just pressing, moving the stick back and forth to separate the top of the cut. And there you can see, come closer to the camera, you can see that cut goes all the way to the base layer. You can see the light blue in the bottom, and there's plenty of room for the thumb to pivot and move back and forth without the edges of the cut really touching each other. So that's all there is to the cutting, and we're pretty much finished at this point. I usually like to look it over, see if there's any place that needs just a little dabbing or pressing, anything I've forgotten. And at that point you're ready to put a stick in your hand and sit around and wait for it to dry. The silicone is actually cured enough on the surface at this point that I can touch it with my bare hand. It's not sticking to me at all. Using the soapy water helps in that regard because water and silicone don't really like each other. So if you get a little coating of soapy water over the silicone, it kind of makes a barrier. So when I touch this, I feel the soapy water on my finger, but it never really gets through to the silicone. And that's nice because now I can actually shape. The silicone feels very squishy at this point, but it's not sticky on the surface. So I can kind of mush the blobs around, kind of pack in the surface without ever really disrupting the overall result. So we've got very nice padding layer everywhere. Silicone is starting to skim on the surface, not really dry enough yet to take the glove off. So I'm just going to grab a stick, put it into my hand. You don't really have to worry about bunching up the palm at this point, but you can be careful with any padding that you have put on the palm of the hand. You don't want to crush it or dislodge it. I'm just going to put this into my palm, nicely fold the stick around it, being careful not to mush this with the tips of my fingers. And that's it. I'm going to add a little more padding in a couple of spots on the tip of the finger if I can. Nope, I'm not. The silicone is too dry to mess with. If you see at this point that there's a place where you want more padding, and often that's the case when I actually hold a stick in my hand, I realize, when I look at that, I kind of want a little more here to sort of build up on that knuckle, maybe a little more here. But it's easy to add more later after this one's completely dry, so we're going to call that done for the night. That's all there is to it. I'll come back and show you the touch-ups in a later video. Thanks for watching.